The man who had torn across France like a thunderstorm, who had pivoted an entire army in a blizzard to save Bastogne, who had never, not once in 3 years of war, let his men see him flinch. That man walked into a shed in a German town called Ohrdruf and vomited, not from weakness, from truth. It was April 12th, 1945. The war in Europe had perhaps 4 weeks left, and what George S. Patton found in that camp, and what he decided to do about it, would become one of the most morally consequential acts of the entire conflict. This is the story of Ohrdruf and Buchenwald, of the ordinary German men and women who lived 5 miles from hell and swore they never knew, and of the general who decided that ignorance, real or manufactured, was no longer an option for anyone within reach of his army. If you want history told straight, no sensationalism, no shortcuts, subscribe to this channel and hit that bell. Stories like this one deserve to be told fully and told right. By the spring of 1945, Patton's Third Army had become the most ferocious instrument of mechanized war in American history. Since breaking out of Normandy the previous August, it had liberated more than 80,000 square miles of occupied Europe, crossing rivers, piercing defensive lines, and moving with a speed that left even German commanders shaking their heads. In the Battle of the Bulge, Patton had pulled off what many military historians still regard as the most remarkable staff pivot of the war, turning 250,000 men 90 degrees in brutal winter conditions to relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. Now, in early April, his army was slicing deep into the German heartland, the industrial core of the Reich, the ancient towns of Thuringia. The war had the feel of a chase. German resistance was collapsing in some places, fierce in others, but everyone on both sides understood that the end was coming. The question was only when. It was in this context, men moving fast, eyes forward, focused on the next objective, that units of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division rolled south from the city of Gotha toward a small town on the map, Ohrdruf. Intelligence had suggested there might be a German underground communications center nearby. What they found instead would stop the most battle-hardened soldiers in their tracks. On April 4th, 1945, as American vehicles passed the last houses at the edge of town, the men smelled it before they saw it. A 15-foot barbed wire fence came into view. Guard towers, empty barracks, and then between the gate and the first buildings, 30 corpses on the ground, their blood still wet from the guards who had fled only hours before. Private Don Timmer of the 89th Infantry Division, then 19 years old, had studied German in high school. He was pulled forward to interpret as the men moved through the camp. He would carry what he saw for the rest of his life. Bodies were stacked in sheds like timber. Some had been shot in the head. Others had died of starvation, reduced to such skeletal conditions that lime had been sprinkled over them not to destroy them. There hadn't been time for that, but simply to cut the smell. A pit a mile from the camp held the remains of an estimated 3,000 men who had died there since the previous January. Prisoners who had survived the death marches that preceded the American arrival described a labor regime of extraordinary brutality, driven by SS guards who had spent their evenings in town, drinking, boasting, socializing with the locals. The camp's purpose, it would emerge, had been to supply forced labor for a massive underground construction project nearby. Tunnels, communications bunkers, potential shelters for the Nazi leadership in the event of a Berlin evacuation. The men who dug those tunnels were primarily Soviet and Polish prisoners, Hungarian Jews, French deportees, Czechs. They had arrived beginning in November 1944. By April, thousands were dead. The division commanders arrived at Ohrdruf by noon that day. Patton himself came at 3:30 in the afternoon. Within 30 minutes, Old Blood and Guts, the man who had said his soldiers would grease their tank treads with German intestines, the man who had never in public shown anything but absolute iron, walked behind a building and was sick. He would later write in his diary, "In a shed was a pile of about 40 completely naked human bodies in the last stages of emaciation. These bodies were lightly sprinkled with lime, not for the purposes of destroying them, but for the purpose of removing the stench." He called Omar Bradley that night. Bradley later recorded the conversation. Patton told him that the Third Army had overrun the first of the Nazi death camps and insisted Bradley come see it himself. "Brad," Patton said, "you'll never believe how bastardly these Krauts can be until you've seen this pest hole yourself." He was not wrong. 8 days later, on April 12th, Eisenhower flew in from his headquarters to visit Ohrdruf alongside Patton and Bradley. This was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, a man who had planned the largest amphibious invasion in history, who had managed the egos and politics of a coalition spanning a dozen nations, who had seen more than almost anyone alive. He walked through Ohrdruf and came out looking pale. An aide said he had never seen Ike look that way before. Eisenhower was already thinking beyond the immediate moment. He cabled General George C. Marshall in Washington that same day. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. He noted that Patton had refused to enter one particular room, where 30 emaciated bodies were piled, because what he had already seen elsewhere in the camp had already made him physically ill. Eisenhower went in deliberately, precisely because he understood what the world would need later. "I made the visit," he wrote, "in order to be in position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." That sentence, written in April 1945. It proved to be one of the most prescient sentences any Allied commander would ever put to paper. Before leaving Ohrdruf, Patton ordered something that would be repeated across the region in the weeks to come. The mayor of Ohrdruf, a man named Albert Schneider, and his wife would be brought to the camp and made to walk through it. They would see what Patton had seen. They would see it in daylight, with their names attached, and without the ability to look away. Mayor Schneider was not an anonymous bystander. His own correspondence from January 1945, recovered after the war, showed that he had written to the regional district authority, complaining that the concentration camp prisoners were regularly marched through the center of town morning and evening, and that the sight of the columns is not exactly pleasant for the population. He had seen the columns. He had reported on the columns. He had asked, effectively, that the routes be changed, not that the camps be closed, not that anyone be helped, but that the columns be rerouted so the townspeople would not have to look. They brought him to the camp on April 7. He and his wife walked through it. That night, they went home and hanged themselves. They left a note. Private Timmer, who had been translating for his unit throughout those days, was called to translate it. It said, "We didn't know, but we knew." Those 5 words are among the most devastating sentences to come out of the Second World War. They are not a confession of guilt in the legal sense. They are something more honest and more damning than that. They are the acknowledgement that a whole society had constructed, for years, a deliberate architecture of not knowing, and that when the architecture collapsed, what remained underneath it was guilt that could not be borne. Patton was not finished. On April 11th, while the events at Ohrdruf were still reverberating through his headquarters, scouts from the 6th Armored Division, advancing toward Weimar, were stopped by a man who told them they were heading toward something called Buchenwald. American forces entered the camp that afternoon. What they found made Ohrdruf look, in Patton's own later words, like a preview. Buchenwald sat on a hill called the Ettersberg, just north of Weimar, the city of Goethe, of Schiller, of German classical civilization, the cultural crown jewel of the German Enlightenment. The camp had been established there in 1937. For 8 years, it had operated in plain view of one of the most educated, culturally sophisticated cities in Germany. The SS guards had lived in Weimar. Their wives had shopped in Weimar's markets. Their children had attended Weimar's schools. The smoke from the Buchenwald crematorium had drifted over Weimar on the wind for years. When American soldiers entered the camp on April 11th, they found nearly 21,000 survivors, emaciated, many barely alive, some too far gone to be saved. They found the crematorium. They found the evidence of medical experiments. They found records indicating that 56,000 people had died there over the course of the camp's operation. Patton visited Buchenwald on April 15th, 3 days after the Ohrdruf tour. He drove through Weimar on his way up the hill. He noted in his letters that the camp was, in his assessment, far worse than Ohrdruf in scale and in the sophistication of its killing apparatus. He had a decision to make. The citizens of Weimar had, by this point, already begun offering their explanations. They had not known. The camp was on the hill. They had heard some things, of course, people talk. But what happened behind those fences, truly, specifically, they could not say they had known. The smoke, well, there had been a factory nearby as well. The columns of prisoners, yes, sometimes you saw them on the road, but one didn't ask questions in those days. One kept one's head down. One survived. Patton had heard enough. He went to the Weimar city administration and told the mayor to produce a list. He wanted residents, specifically middle and upper class men of military age, those who had benefited most from the Reich and had the most power to have asked questions. He wanted over 1,000 of them, dressed appropriately, assembled and ready. According to the Wikipedia article on Buchenwald, sourced to multiple historical accounts, Patton ordered the mayor of Weimar to bring 1,000 citizens to Buchenwald, specifying they were to be predominantly men of military age from the middle and upper classes. The Germans had to walk a 25-kilometer round trip under American armed guard. The engineers were instructed not to bury the remaining dead until the civilians had passed through. The tours were intended, in the explicit thinking of the American command, to ensure that the German people would take responsibility for what the Nazi regime had done and to prevent the atrocities from being dismissed later as propaganda or exaggeration. They came on April 15th. Margaret Bork-White of Life magazine was at the gate when they arrived. She photographed them, men in suits and hats, women in their Sunday dresses and sensible shoes. One photograph shows a German woman, middle-aged, well-dressed, her hand raised to cover her eyes as she passes a truck loaded with corpses. She is not screaming. She is turning away quietly, as though she might still, even now, find a way not to see. An American account from that day describes what happened when one group of civilians arrived at the camp gate laughing and talking among themselves, as though this were some kind of obligation to be endured and dismissed. An officer saw this, turned the group around, marched them back to the entrance, and took them through again, more slowly this time, past each exhibit, past each face, past each piece of evidence, in silence. When that second march ended, and the civilians walked back down the hill toward Weimar, there was no more laughter. Over 1,200 residents ultimately made the tour, according to the US HMM caption on photographs taken that week. Some sources put the number at 1,500 or more. It took 2 days for all of them to pass through. No precautions were taken against the typhus that was still active in parts of the camp. American soldiers stood along the route, rifles slung, watching. The reporting of the time captured something else. Scores of people fainted. German nurses, trained medical professionals, collapsed on the paths between exhibits. Grown men, men who had lived through a decade of Nazi Germany, who had survived the air raids, who had buried sons on the Eastern Front, those men wept openly as they walked through Buchenwald. Eisenhower, for his part, was pursuing the same logic on a global scale. He cabled Marshall and requested that members of Congress and prominent American newspaper editors be flown to Germany to see the camps personally. The request went to the Secretary of War and to President Truman, who approved it. Delegations of senators, representatives, and editors made the trip. Edward R. Murrow of CBS News broadcast his account of Buchenwald live on April 15th, the same day as the civilian tour. It remains one of the most harrowing pieces of radio journalism ever produced. Murrow told his audience that he had been to the camp, that he had seen what was there, and that he was going to describe it, but that his words would not be adequate. For most of it, he said, "I have no words." That was the point. The evidence had to be witnessed. Photographs could be dismissed. Words could be dismissed. But standing in that place, smelling it, seeing it with the full weight of your own presence, that could not be undone. Patton, Eisenhower, Bradley, none of them had planned this. They had stumbled into it. But each of them, in his own way, had understood immediately that what they were seeing was not simply a military matter. It was a historical one. And that the historical record would require witnesses who could not be called liars. As for what the German civilians of Weimar and Ohrdruf had known, the historical record, assembled in the decades since, is clearer on this point than any of them were willing to be in April 1945. The mayor of Ohrdruf had written letters about the prisoners marching through town. Local schoolchildren had watched prisoner columns from the roadsides. SS guards had socialized openly in local taverns, sometimes boasting. The camp at Buchenwald had been operated for 8 years within sight of one of Germany's most celebrated cities. The smoke was real. The smell was real. The columns were real. The question of what ordinary German civilians knew and when, and to what degree, is one that historians have debated for 80 years and will continue to debate. The answer is almost certainly not uniform. It varied by location, by social position, by individual willingness to notice and to ask. Some people knew a great deal. Some knew only fragments. Some had carefully, deliberately constructed lives in which they did not know. But the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife left a note, and the note did not say they were innocent. There is a final thread to pull in this story. Patton, despite everything, despite the vomiting at Ohrdruf, despite the diary entries and the letters to Eisenhower, despite ordering 1,000 civilians to march up a hill and look at what their civilization had produced, Patton would later, in the months after Germany's surrender, make statements about the denazification process that caused enormous controversy. He questioned whether it was practical to remove all former Nazi party members from positions of authority. He made comparisons that his superiors found deeply offensive. In October 1945, Eisenhower relieved him of command of the Third Army. History is not always clean. The man who stood at the gate of Ohrdruf and understood, better perhaps than anyone, that these atrocities could not be allowed to disappear into silence. That same man later struggled with the political aftermath of what had been uncovered. It does not cancel what he did in April 1945. But it is part of the truth, and the truth is what we owe the dead. The 280,000 people who passed through Buchenwald during its 8 years of operation. The estimated 56,000 who did not survive. The 7,000 who died at Ohrdruf. The uncounted thousands who perished on the death marches in the final weeks of the war, driven through the villages of Thuringia in columns that everyone saw and everyone, they would later say, somehow did not know. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife understood what Patton had understood when he walked behind that building and was sick. That there are moments when the gap between what you have told yourself and what you actually know becomes impossible to maintain. When the evidence is in front of you, close enough to smell, and you still reach for the phrase, "I didn't know," that is not ignorance. That is a choice. Patton took that choice away. He marched them up the hill. He made them stand in front of it. He refused to let the smoke disperse into the comfortable German spring. It was the right thing to do. It was, for all his contradictions, one of the most important things George S. Patton ever did. Not a battle. Not a breakthrough. Not a flanking maneuver that the military academies still teach. This, an act of forced historical reckoning, carried out in the ruins of the Third Reich, in the last weeks of the most destructive war in human history. Eisenhower had said it clearly. He had walked through Ohrdruf deliberately, so that no one could ever call it propaganda. We are told, he would say, standing before the evidence, that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least, he knows what he is fighting against. The German civilians who walked up that hill to Buchenwald in April 1945 knew it too. They had always known something. Now they knew they could not pretend otherwise. And a photographer from Life magazine was there to make sure the world knew that they knew. 80 years later, the photographs remain. The records remain. The testimony of men like Don Timmer, who translated a suicide note and carried those words for the rest of his life, remains. The evidence Eisenhower preserved remains. That is the answer to, we didn't know. We have the photographs, we have the documents, we have the testimony, we have Buchenwald itself, still standing as a memorial on the Ettersberg Hill above Weimar, preserved precisely because Eisenhower understood in April 1945 that someone, someday, would try to say it never happened. It happened. Patton made sure they looked. If this story moved you, If you believe this history deserves to be told fully and without flinching, subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who should see it. Leave a comment below about what struck you most. Click the bell so you don't miss what comes next. History like this is not comfortable, but it is necessary.